Well, good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and it's time for us to get right into Word Nerd Wednesday. Today, I want to talk about a couple of similar and quite possibly related words that are likely familiar to most Tolkien readers. Etten, as in the Etten Moors, and Ent. Now, I want to start with something on Ent that comes to us from one of my favorite Hobbit-related gems, Douglas A. Anderson's Annotated Hobbit. That's a really great volume if you're interested in learning more about The Hobbit, but aren't quite ready to dive into the huge volume of research in John Ratliff's History of the Hobbit. So Note 5 in Chapter 4 of Anderson's Annotated Edition has a little bit of information about the place called the Etten Moors, or the Etten Dales, which is just a region within the Etten Moors. To get there, I have to start with something else. Now, if you've listened to the PPP, you've probably heard me talk about the nomenclature. That refers to Tolkien's nomenclature of the Lord of the Rings, which was something that he created as a commentary in order to help translators who had the unenviable task of translating the Lord of the Rings, along with all of its very English names for characters, creatures, and places. You can read that nomenclature in its entirety in Hammond and Scull's The Lord of the Rings, A Reader's Companion. That's another work I often cite and highly recommend. In the entry for Ettendales, Tolkien explains that it is meant to be a common speech, not Elvish name, though it contains an obsolete element, Etten, troll, ogre. Now, Old English Aorten, Middle English Etten, is usually translated as giant or monster. Now, it's spelled Etain with a Y, E-T-A-Y-N, in the Middle English poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And in the 1925 translation that was edited by Tolkien and E.V. Gordon, it's glossed as ogre, giant. Anderson also points out that Grendel, the monster in Beowulf, is also referred to as an Aorten. Now, that Old English word Aorten is a cognate of the Norse word Jotun, which means a giant. And if that sounds familiar, well, you've probably watched Thor and have heard about Jotunheim. That's the home of the giants in Norse mythology. Jotun has cognates in the modern Scandinavian languages, like the Swedish jette, which also means giant, but it's more like an intensifier as a prefix. If bra means good, then jättebra means really, really good. Now that's interesting enough on its own. All the Old English and Old Norse connections are, but there may actually be a connection between Aorten and another Old English word for giant, and that's the word Ent. Now, again, for listeners of the PPP, you have heard me talk about the Eald Enta Geweorc, the old work of giants. Now, it's a phrase that appears in several Old English poems to describe ancient Roman ruins in Britain. It seems to be the word that inspired Tolkien to invent the race of Ents in The Lord of the Rings. In fact, here's a little something on that from one of Tolkien's letters. It's number 157. Speaking of the Ents, Tolkien writes, "As usually with me, they grew rather out of their name than the other way about. I always felt that something ought to be done about the peculiar Anglo-Saxon word Ent for a giant or mighty person of long ago, to whom all old works were ascribed." Now, in turn, that letter was quoted in The Ring of Words, Tolkien and the Oxford English Dictionary, which is another book that every Tolkien fan and word nerd really should read, where it has a combined entry for both of these words, saying, in Old English, there were at least two inherited terms meaning giant, Aorten and Ent. Now, it goes on to talk about all the things we just talked about, including Jotunheim and Sir Gawain, and then goes on to talk about the Etten Moors, saying, in the drafts of the first two books of The Lord of the Rings, this region, meaning the Etten Moors, is called the Entish Dales or Entish Lands. At this stage of Tolkien's conception, Ent and Etten are interchangeable, both with a bad sense. Then as the concept of Treebeard and his people gradually emerges from earlier hints about tree men or tree giants, the two words part company. This can be seen in the plot plans. Treebeard is at first a dangerous giant, and we see this in the Treason of Isengard, which is the 7th volume of History of Middle-earth. But then is planned to turn out to be a decent giant. A penciled note by Tolkien expresses the difference between trolls, stone inhabited by goblin spirit, stone giants, and the tree folk, to which is added in ink, Ents. Now, I want to add one more thing, sort of tangentially related. That word, Etten, is something you might have seen before, especially if you've read the works of Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis. In the Chronicles of Narnia, specifically the book The Silver Chair, Lewis tells us about the Ettins, a race of giants living in Ettensmoor to the north of Narnia. Interestingly, like the stone giants in The Hobbit, Lewis's Ettins play a game that involves throwing rocks at a gorge. Well, folks, that is it for today's Word Nerd Wednesday. But come back as we explore the wide, wild, wonderful world of words weekly on Wednesdays. And if you've got another W word that I can throw in there, let me know. But if there is a word you want to know more about, please let me know by emailing bartleman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Now, if these few minutes leave you wanting more Tolkien content or more Word Nerd content, be sure to check out the Prancing Pony podcast, where we've spent 7 years so far walking through the books, including a ton of philological sidebars, and just having that nice chat at the pub about our favorite books. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Third Age Thursday. Please like and subscribe on YouTube, and follow or subscribe on your podcast apps to make sure that each episode gets downloaded to your device. Follow @Tolkien Times on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.